Welcome to Lecture 10 on business continuity. Business continuity is essentially about how to prepare for or respond to, recover from a disaster. And so, one way of really knowing whether or not the company you're working for has a long-term future is whether or not it actually has a business continuity plan or not, right? If companies thought through, the potential of disaster occurring and then anticipated what it will do in those circumstances, it's very likely that company sees itself existing into the future, and because it wants to respond to and keep in operation under disaster circumstances. And so many companies, particularly new companies, do not have a continuity management plan in place. And it's unfortunate because when disaster does strike, they have no idea of how they're going to recover. Many companies were negatively affected by the pandemic for this reason entirely, actually. There was no plan in place. They didn't know how to switch their operation in some cases because they just simply couldn't in order to continue providing service. And so the focus here is going to be on the availability, for our purposes, on data. So disasters can damage your critical data. It can damage your hardware, software. People can be affected by disasters, as well as the facilities themselves. So business continuity is related to risk management because our objective will involve the identification and feasible mitigation of significant threats. We need to think through what are some significant threats, and universities, for example, will have a different threat profile to, let's say, a private sector organization, and we're going to rank them and document what our essential services are, and then construct a response in terms of continuity to continue operations, and then recover our operation to its former state. So part of this will be involved with conducting a business continuity assessment, and the goal there will be to require the organization to recognize the risk and impacts of threats to availability. And so you're going to have somebody that's responsible for conducting risk assessment. So here at the university, there's a committee whose function is to conduct risk assessment and create a policy for the university to deal with risk and threats to the organization in order to continue its operation. It's endorsed by the president and jointly with Durham College, actually, in this particular case. It's something unique within our university community. So in this lecture, we'll be discussing business continuity. Business continuity is really about how to prepare for, to respond to, and to recover from disaster. Now, the focus here is going to be on availability. Now, disasters can damage critical data, can damage hardware, software, people, of course, and then the facilities themselves. So before we get into this, we need to know something about what we mean by a disaster. What do we mean by disaster? Well, disaster is a disruption of normal business functions, where the time for returning to normalcy would seriously impact the ability to maintain operations. That disruption could result from a natural event, it could result from a human mistake, or indeed willful damage. Disasters can occur at any time without
warnings that we need to have a plan in place and a policy for developing that plan. And this is why business continuity is important. Now, a good way of you knowing whether or not a company sees itself being around for the long term is whether or not it has a business continuity plan in place. Many enterprises, particularly startups, they wouldn't have a business continuity plan. And it's very likely that regardless of the size of the company, you're likely to have a physical or IT related disaster within 5 years, regardless of size. And so it's super important to have some thinking around disasters and recovery. For this reason, you want to be able to continue your operation. If you thought about it ahead of time, you will have anticipated things going wrong and have a plan in place for it. Right? So, and then most companies don't have a documented plan on how to guide them in the event of an outage. And so you can see that happening in real time with the pandemic. Actually, many companies didn't have a plan in place for a disaster, and the ones that did recovered more quickly. Part of business continuity management is doing risk management, and you've got to be able to identify feasible and mitigation of significant threats. So you have to be able to identify and mitigate those threats, and then you've got to document your essential services, as well as a constructive response for continuity and recovery operations. So that's what really this management is about. You really got to know what the core elements of the business are, how you're going to protect them, how you're going to recover to the point you were before the disaster took place. So generally, it's a good idea for organizations to create a policy on this subject. The goal of such a policy will be to require the organization to recognize risk and the impacts of threats to availability. To do this, you're going to have to do a risk assessment, and then you're going to have to assign responsibility for conducting risk assessments. Now, it has to be said that everybody has a slightly different attitude to risk. Right? So some people are very risk averse, some people not so much. And part of the work here is trying to get a consensus for practical reasons around the risk, the risk that the business is willing to accept. So you need to do a business impact assessment based on your risk assessment, and that's usually conducted annually. You've got to assign responsibility for conducting this impact analysis also. So business impact analysis is a multi-step collaborative activity that's going to involve business process owners, the stakeholders, corporate officers. It identifies the essential services, processes, and recovery time frames. With the BIA, you're typically incorporating 3 metrics for all services and processes. The maximum tolerable downtime is the total length of time it can be unavailable. Your system can be unavailable without causing significant harm. The recovery time objective is the maximum time a system resource can be unavailable before an unacceptable impact. And the recovery point objective is the point in time prior to disruption or system outage that the data can be recovered. That is to say, the acceptable level of data loss. This policy and the impact assessment should result in a business continuity plan. That is to say, a plan of action. You need a plan. You need a plan which is a well-written document that's going to be reviewed for accuracy and tested for its robustness for success. It's the responsibility of management to support budget and clearly define responsibility for the plan's development, its ownership and maintenance. Executive management or the board of directors are typically accountable for approving the plan. It's a very high level document, right? So it has to be approved at a senior level. The BCP components consist of disaster preparation. So what needs to be done in anticipation of disaster? So the natural outcome of a risk assessment. And then systems can be designed for automatic failover redundancy. Valuable data can be backed up and stored off-site. If there is a disaster response, what should be done immediately following the incident? What procedures, that is to say evacuation, relocation, and communication should take place in response to the disaster. A second component here would be business contingency. So what are the alternate business processes used throughout the organization prior to full recovery? Turning on redundant systems, redirecting requests. Business recovery is the process of recovering information systems to their original state using prioritized and a systematic methodology. So you need to restore data or rebuild the data centers. That's our goal with business recovery there. The plan should be based on some assumptions. So you want to make sure that the event occurs at the worst possible time. I mean, you don't sort of plan for maybe it's your year end where things are going to be very busy and then you get a disaster. What do you do then? You need to think about the worst case scenario, as a loss of business and systems, that key personnel may not be available. Not all people will be available in your recovery team. You may need to train new people. You may have to have critical third parties may be affected. And your other locations and significant business partners may be affected also. So you've got to plan for this. Your plan has to take into account this. You've got to have backups. You've got to have redundancy in order to make sure that your plan is indeed robust. It's generally a good idea for companies to have a policy on this subject. So the policy will require that the plan is developed, approved, and maintained. It requires a strategy, business continuity strategy, and procedures going to have to be developed. It'll specify the components of the plan, and it'll assign ownership and responsibility for the plan. It will require involvement and approval by the board of directors. The board of directors will provide leadership, will ultimately approve policy because it's legally accountable for the actions of the organization. Executive management will provide the leadership. It will demonstrate its commitment. It devotes resources to business continuity, and it's responsible for the plan's development and adoption. The operational side of business continuity takes place with the business continuity team. So they're going to be responsible for managing a disaster, maintaining the plan pre and post disaster. There should be a coordinator that's accountable for the management, preparation, response, and recovery, and continuity of the operation. Operational management is going to be responsible for defining the operational needs of the department, creating and maintaining functional department and contingency procedures. So the people that are essentially the front line, using the data on a day-to-day basis, they will, feed you information around what their needs are, what their departmental contingency procedures will be. And then the IT department will participate in all aspects of the plan: development, implementation, testing, maintenance. And they're ultimately responsible for recovery of information and information systems. The HR department is involved too, because they have to be prepared to provide services to employees in the event of an emergency or disaster. You will have most likely a training department, and they're going to be responsible for developing and delivering business continuity training and implementation and an awareness program. You're likely to have an internal audit department, who will audit the plan and report findings to management. The audit will satisfy best practices separating from the duties, people are actually doing the work, and oversight. And vendors that are referenced in the plan should understand what their expectations are of the organizations, and generally they're going to have a contract in place. You're going to be able to, source that contract when necessary, so that you know that they're going to be following the relevant parts of the plan. Maybe you have a cyber security firm that you've employed, for example, as your third-party vendor or an insurer, let's say. And we'll do this in class. Think through, if you are ranking from 1 to 5, the impact on you as a customer of the bank. So look at, if your ATM system was available, the branches were open, or the closest local branch was closed, but the other ones were open. Internet banking was available, but branches were open. Core processing systems were unavailable, but deposits and withdrawals could be accepted. And communications capabilities between branches disrupted, and tellers have to work in an offline mode. Right? So think about what would be the most, what would have the greatest impact on you as a customer of the bank. Now look at the same items again. If you are a member of the bank's executive management, are your ratings going to change? What factors will cause this ranking to change? Think through that, because they may not be the same. What this exercise should help you appreciate is that risk is related to the perspective of the person looking at that particular event. Right? So a disaster, will mean slightly different things to different people depending on your perspective. The business continuity team will assess damage to the organization. They are the ones that are going to formally declare a disaster and activate the plan. They will manage the response, the continuity and recovery activities. They'll provide leadership throughout the crisis. They provide a post-disaster assessment of recovery and response. They plan impact analysis wherever changes in systems or procedures, facilities, or organization necessitate modification. They test the plan, and they review the plan annually with the Chief Operating Officer. The business continuity policy will designate the team, outline their responsibilities and authority. For the continuity team, it's going to designate their structure, their function, their authority. You may designate one person to appoint team members, for example. So it has to be pretty organized because you don't want to be working things out during the disaster, not the time. So you've got to require that specific key elements are predefined. So you've got to establish the organizational structure to respond to an emergency. You've got to designate an emergency command center. You've got to prepare notification procedures. You have to designate alternative operation sites. You may have to invest in redundant infrastructure or alternate sites for data processing. You would want to develop and implement procedures to support, respond, recovery and continuity activities, all things to keep your business running in the event of a disaster. Alternate data sites provide facilities for continued information processing. A hot site will be a fully operational location. It's configured with redundancy and communications. A data stream to a hot site is done on a real-time or near real-time basis. A mirrored site is an exact file system or data set of a data set copy of a site. A warm site supports operations including communications, peripheral devices, and power. You may have spare computers there that need to be configured, and data there will need to be restored. A cold site is one that is an alternate location that has power and secure access. A mobile site will be a self-contained unit that arrives with the required equipment and peripherals, and data there is going to need to be restored. In the event of a disaster, you know, who should assume command of operations in the event of a disaster? So normally it's going to be the chief coordinator of the business continuity team, but that should be really clear from the plan itself. The disaster response plan will address what should be done immediately following a significant incident. It defines who has authority to declare a disaster. It defines who has authority to contact external entities. It defines evacuation procedures. It will define emergency communication and modification procedures also. Upon declaration of a disaster, all business continuity team members should report to a designated command and control center. There should be an occupant emergency plan, which describes evacuation and shelter-in-place procedures in the event of a threat or incident to health or safety of personnel. So think about, for example, a hospital with staff, let's say, you need to get them out, have a plan in place for evacuation. Now, as a goal, you would want to limit injury and damage, obviously, to the organization. You want to make initial assessments of the damage and determine the appropriate activity. So you've got essentially 4 stages. You've got detection, so responsibility for of whoever first discovers or receives the information about the event, notification to the business continuity team, and then confirmation of that receipt. Declaration by the BCT members to evaluate the situation and if necessary, activate the plan, and then activation. So that's going to be the responsibility of the business continuity team leader. Other response considerations may include public safety, employee relations, media relations, customer relations, and crime actually as well in the case of looting and vandalism. So these are things we're going to have to be considerate of in our plan and our response to it. Operational contingency plans addresses how an organization's essential business processes will be delivered during the recovery process. So you want to develop that at a departmental level. So each business unit, for example, should have a plan in place or a sub-plan, let's say, and this contingency plan is the responsibility of the business process owner. So within a business unit, there will be a head of department there, and that person would be most responsible for having a contingency plan for that business unit. The goal of the contingency plan is to continue to provide services to customers as well as comply with regulatory requirements and continue internal operations. This may be implemented either at the original site or on alternative location. Not all operations can continue. Critical services should have been identified during the risk assessment. Right? So you need to be aware of that. Business continuity contingency operating procedures should detail the specific steps required to carry out operations. They should follow the same basic form as the standard operating procedures, but there's going to be a difference between normal operating environments, that is for standard operating procedures, and business contingencies. So that's for the rare, unusual case of disaster. So let's say, for example, you have a prison that's regulated by a biometric authenticator. Right? So that's how access control is managed and monitored. But the system goes down due to a blackout. Right? What might be a good business contingency procedure in this particular case? So I'm very curious about think about that. Think about if you have one access control biometrics and you want a contingency, what would that be? How would you those are kind of things you have to think about when you're planning developing a business continuity plan. Recovering from disaster is generally the domain of the IT department. So recovery activities can be immediate failover to redundant systems, procuring new systems, restoring data. It's a good practice to break down the plan into categories. So the mainframe, let's say, the network, communications, facilities. Each category will normally have its own recovery strategy. Right? So having a redundant mainframe is likely going to be too expensive, but having a redundant router might not be, right? So you have to also think through the cost and benefits of having redundant systems there. Now, the emergency is not the time to figure out how to restore a system, right? We've said that already. So you've got to be able to address and document these things by procedures. You should have, it should be written for audiences that are not familiar with the system, because the people that are familiar with the system may not be there at the time. And then you have to have a recovery manual for specific systems. Procedures should be developed, designed, tested, documented, and approved prior to when the disaster strikes. Procedures should explain what needs to be done, when, where, and how. The key is to respond fast using these predefined steps. So these procedures should be reviewed annually. It's a big job, actually. It's an ongoing project, actually, to kind of deal with, potential disasters that, may never occur. During the resumption phase, the objective is to transition to normal operations. You've got, two major activities there. You've got to validate and verify the recovery systems are operating correctly. And then you've got deactivation. So the official notification that the organization is no longer operating in emergency or disaster mode. We can go back to our standard operating procedures, for example. You also want to test the plan. So you want to be able to, on a scheduled basis, so let's say once a year, do use different testing techniques. So maybe you do a preliminary a review of the plan and procedure. You do a structured walkthrough. You can talk through that with somebody. A tabletop simulation. So participants will practice steps for a specific scenario. Parallel functional testing will validate plans for a specific system. And then you've got, full-scale testing. So, will disrupt, will suspend normal operations and see how plans and procedures are implemented. The business continuity plan will need to be revisited on a scheduled basis to ensure its components are accurately reflect the needs of the organization. Whenever there's something new, there's a new product, for example, a new service, a new change in a major vendor, let's say. So you've got to review the risk assessment and the impact assessment also. The responsibility for maintaining the plan should be assigned to a specific role. So normally it's going to be the information security officer or somebody senior manager within the organization. You want to be able to understand and review any agreements you have with vendors. So often business continuity plans depend on vendors to provide services. So maybe you have loaned, or you have the potential to loan equipment, for example. You have a person helping you with your response to a cyber attack, for example. You've got to be able to document and catalog your service level agreements here. How quickly do you expect the vendor to respond? What type and quantity of replacement equipment is guaranteed to be available? And what personnel and facility availability is there? And then the status of the organization in the event of a major disaster involving multiple vendor clients. How much of a priority are you to your service to the vendor that you've got third-party service with. Auditing the plan is a feature that regulated industries like healthcare they have to have a business continuity plan. The auditors will examine the plan and likely ask, if the plan's written, has management approved, how often is the risk assessment and business impact assessment reviewed and by whom. These are the kind of questions that an auditor of a plan is going to be engaged with. So we need to know something about how often the plan is reviewed, by whom, if their policies and procedures are documented, where is it stored, who's on the team, what training they've had, how was the plan tested, is there a written testing plan, how often is the plan tested, are the results documented, and who's responsible for maintaining the plan. That's all part of auditing. Business continuity plan testing and maintenance policy is generally recommended for organizations to have this policy in place. It designates the testing and maintenance criteria and responsibility. So, you've got to be able to test responsibility that's involved with testing and responsibility and criteria, and then review and update responsibility and criteria. So, figuring out what our recovery point objective is, or for example. So some summary questions for you to think about as part of your review. What's the most important business continuity document that we've discussed today? A second question is, can any organization reasonably justify not having this document in place? And then thirdly, who is responsible for disaster response and recovery at the time of disaster? So make sure you have good answers to these questions, and I will see you in class.